So it is a really great pleasure for me to introduce Elic today as not only a very brilliant scholar, but a very wonderful colleague. He's come out and worked with us in Rapid in the past, and we've worked on there, so it's really great to have him here. So thank you so much, Elic, for agreeing to give a talk for us. Just a few accessibility things. You can click live transcript on if that will help with accessing the talk. And if you have any technical issues, reach out to Amy Winchester or me, and we'll try to help you out. So without any further ado, welcome, Elic.
Thank you, Arena. Would you be able to turn on permissions for me to share my screen?
Did it work?
Yeah, now it's
okay.
All right. Cool. Yeah, thank you, Arena, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here. Really excited to be giving this talk to you guys. Specifically what this talk is going to be about is the Eastern agricultural complex, the origins of domestication in Eastern North America. And I specifically want to talk about kind of the process of initial domestication, how it happened, and really the relevance of studying this for contemporary and future society. And before I go further, I do want to briefly acknowledge that those of us in the United States do currently reside on native land. The University of Michigan is on the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I'm personally joining you from Narragansett country today. And this talk deals exclusively with the histories of native peoples in additional regions of this continent. And my research has and continues to benefit from their histories. I thank them for their stewardship of this land, recognize the ongoing process of colonization that persists today, and will follow and support native leadership in their struggle for sovereignty, self-determination, and land reclamation. And so I want to start off by talking about anthropogenic climate change. We are, as we're all aware, facing climate crisis on an unprecedented scale, right? Anthropogenic climate change is causing all sorts of problems in myriad ways for human society. And particularly today, what I want to talk about is the impacts on our agricultural economy. We know that temperature changes, moisture changes, extreme weather events, all sorts of things are going to have a negative impact on agriculture in really a diverse set of ways, and there's tons of literature discussing this. And really, I think that the state of our subsistence economy is going to worsen a lot of these effects. And so understanding how to deal with these effects necessitates understanding the nature of our subsistence economy in the present. Most of us could go to our local grocery store, I assume, and find an incredible variety of foods, right? We can get all sorts of different foodstuffs from all over the world. And this creates the impression that you and I have very broad and diverse diets. And in a certain sense, this is definitely true. But in another sense, it's a bit misleading, right? If you actually break down the stats on this, while our diets might seem broad, in actuality, they're quite narrow in a lot of ways. 75% of the world's calories come from actually just 12 different plants and 5 different animal species. And of the plant-based calories that people consume around the world, wheat, corn, and rice make up 60% of that, right? So we know that this perception of us having an incredible diverse diet, the fact that we could get food from all over the world, isn't quite accurately portraying the real reality at the base of our subsistence economy. We really do have quite a narrow diet. And on one hand, this is very efficient, right? We can obtain lots of calories and lots of food relative to the time and the labor investments that we put into procuring it. That's why most of us here today are probably not farmers, but we're still able to eat food that was farmed. On the other hand, such a narrow diet that is so specialized is a bit risky, right? This sort of diet can be less resilient, particularly in the face of climate change like we're currently facing. And I definitely believe, as hopefully many of us do, that archaeology has a part to play in kind of shaping our future as a species. We all feel probably that archaeologists should try to make society and make life better for people in the present. That this is fundamentally a big reason why we do what we do. And the unique thing about our discipline is that what we can contribute is millennia worth of case studies of human behavior, right? We can use our data from the archaeological record to test all sorts of ideas about economics and subsistence and culture and climate change and how societies in the past have adapted in various ways or not. We're also really good at identifying processes that are at work in human society and how these processes shaped past societies and how they're also at work in the present. And personally, I do think that we can actually play a part in impacting policy. Our unique position as a scientific field with this wealth of historical data permits us to test policy effectiveness and develop policy, I think, using archaeological data. And the way that most of us probably think about doing this is probably something like this kind of simple schematic that I threw up here. If we're talking about agricultural policy in the present, a lot of archaeologists, when we're writing a broader impact statement or something, will try to find analogous situations in the archaeological record, kind of past analogies that we can draw upon to inform on contemporary policy. But of course, policymakers in the present generally don't pay much attention to archaeology. They tend to draw on kind of their own bodies of knowledge to develop policy, and that doesn't really include archaeology in most cases. If archaeologists want to contribute to a discussion of agricultural policy, for example, they could certainly talk about historical and archaeological cases of agricultural activities that have taken place. But a policymaker would quite justifiably, I think, question whether Mesopotamian farming practices are really relevant for informing on contemporary policy, right? The demographics, the political systems, the economic systems, the crops that people are exploiting, the geography, the climate, there's so many differences in a lot of archaeological case studies that I think it is somewhat valid to question whether or not these are really analogous situations that would allow us to say anything meaningful about contemporary policy and about contemporary agricultural activities. And so what I would propose is that we kind of rethink how we're engaging with policy. I think that we should do something more like this. What archaeologists, in my opinion, should be doing, and what I try to do as an archaeologist, albeit very early in my career, is engage with broader kind of bodies of knowledge, higher level theory and theoretically informed models. I think that there's great utility in us as archaeologists testing hypotheses that are derived from theory, derived from these kind of big picture models, and helping to refine then these theory and models. So this kind of reciprocal reflexive relationship between this deductive, inductive flow of science between archaeology and theory allows us to contribute to theory. And this then broader set of knowledge is really what policymakers are drawing upon. Because very few policymakers are really looking in the historical record and finding examples of things that they can apply at the present, right? They study politics, they study microeconomics, they study all sorts of other things, and they derive policy from that. And so I think for archaeology to have more of an impact on policy, we need to engage with the theory more than directly with policy by trying to find analogous situations, because there probably really aren't any. And so this theoretical model I'm definitely lifting from Jim O'Connell's 1995 paper on ethnoarchaeology and why it needs a general theory of behavior. And what Jim is actually proposing in that is that we should test theory and models against ethnographic data and then apply those theory and models to archaeological data. I'm switching this up and saying we can test these theory and models against archaeology and then apply them to policy. And to illustrate how I think that this might happen, I want to talk about domestication. Domestication, of course, was independently developed in a number of different locations around the world. Every year, it seems like we found and identified new independent centers of domestication. This paper from Mindy Zeter in 2017 is identifying potentially 15 separate ones. And the one that I want to talk to you about today is that occurred in Eastern North America. In interior Eastern North America and the lower Midwest and kind of the upper Mid-South, beginning around 5,000 years ago, native peoples in this region began to domesticate a series of crops that are called by archaeologists as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, or the EAC. These crops first begin to appear in domesticated varieties around 5,000 years ago. And for this talk, I'm going to use a very particular definition of domestication, referring to actual kind of genetic changes that then have phenotypic consequences that are a consequence of activities or behaviors of another species. So humans modifying the genome and the phenotype of these species. Squash is the first of the EAC crops to have been phenotypically changed by humans. We've got evidence for this from around 5,000 years ago. A couple hundred years later then, sunflower is domesticated in central Tennessee. And these two crops are probably broadly familiar to most of us. We have certainly often eaten sunflower seeds or squash, but the rest of the EAC crops are a little bit less familiar to most people. The next one to be phenotypically domesticated is Sump Weed, which is also called marsh elder. It's an annual plant, a weed that really loves kind of disturbed habitats. And it produces seeds, which can be consumed. Similarly, there's a plant called goosefoot, sometimes just called quinoa, which was domesticated around 3,800 years ago. And this plant is a relative of quinoa, which many of us have also eaten. It's a South American variety of this genus. And again, this is a weedy annual plant that produces reasonably nutritious seeds that native peoples consumed for millennia. There are then two other species that are often treated as part of the EAC, maygrass and little barley. These two taxa are found in large numbers and in association with other EAC crops, beginning really around 3,800 years ago. But we don't yet have any evidence that they were actually domesticated in the strict sense. It seems like they were managed. It seems like they were part of this crop complex. But we haven't found morphological or physiological changes in this plant as of yet. And there's a final species, Erect Knotweed, that we once treated the same as maygrass and little barley as part of the EAC, but not a real domesticate. But we now know, thanks to the work of Natalie Mueller, that around 2,000 years ago, we do actually have a phenotypic change in this species and that it was domesticated. So these EAC crops, as I said, are mostly not familiar to us. And the reason for that is that actually all of them except for sunflower are now extinct. The species of cucurbita pepo, of squash, that we have now is actually a later introduction, apparently, from Central America. Sunflower is still the original domesticated variety from Tennessee, but all of these other crops now only exist in Eastern North America in their wild types. We no longer have the domesticated varieties that native peoples developed beginning around 5,000 years ago. And I really want to engage with this question of why would you domesticate crops? This is, of course, one of the long-standing questions that archaeologists have always asked about the origins of farming, the origins of food production, the origins of agriculture. And I think that a lot of the debate over this has to do with the question of intensification. And for this talk, I'm going to define intensification in a very particular way. Most archaeologists, when they talk about intensification, refer simply to an increase in subsistence yields. Yields economically is referring to outputs per unit land area, typically, kind of the gross outputs. In the case of agricultural economics, which is what this talk is about, I'm going to refer to calories as the same as these outputs. And so when you increase yields, you're increasing your calories per unit land area, per acre, per kilometer squared, something like that. This is how most archaeologists treat the concept of yields. And this is how most archaeologists, therefore, treat the concept of intensification, that intensification is just an increase in yield, something you do to get more calories out of the land. However, I think that this is a bit too broad. There's an archaeologist, Christopher Morgan, who's argued this, that intensification as something that just increases yields covers such a wide variety of processes that it's a little bit less useful as a concept than we could make it. And he advocates sticking with Esther Boesrup's definition from 1965 in this book, The Conditions of Agricultural Growth. And in this book, Boesrup talks about intensification as an increase in yields that is made possible through a decrease in economic efficiency. Right? Economic efficiency refers to outputs per unit time, in this case, calories per unit time, something like kilocalories per hour. And so whenever you're intensifying in the Boesrupian sense, you are increasing your subsistence yields, but you're decreasing the efficiency at which you obtain those yields through more time costs, through more labor costs that are put into that. And so this question of intensification and the origins of domestication, I think starts to make a lot more sense when we understand intensification in this Bosrupian sense. And there are basically two camps arguing over domestication in Eastern North America in recent years. One group of researchers argues that there is no intensification prior to domestication, and that domestication does not result from Bosrupian intensification. Advocates of this hypothesis argue that domestication occurs in times and places of resource richness and abundance. Bruce Smith is the main guy in the region who argues for this, and his floodplain weed theory argues that it's these rich and abundant floodplain areas in which domestication first develops in this region. And it does so not as a result of intensification, but as a result of just that environmental richness and abundance. In contrast, there's another group of researchers who argues that intensification is actually what drives domestication. That domestication doesn't occur in times and places of resource abundance, but it occurs in times and places in which population growth or environmental change, or perhaps both of these things, have led to intensification of subsistence economies, have led to increased yields, but at the expense of efficiency. Winterhalter and Goland in their 1997 chapter is a good example of this argument. And to understand this, I think we do need to understand a bit of this model, which is called the prey model or the diet breadth model sometimes. I don't want to get too deep into it, but I think it is really necessary to understand what's going on in terms of intensification. And so in the prey model, the objective of using this model is to determine which food resources an individual, a forager, should elect to take and exploit and consume, and which they would expect to ignore and pass over as they're foraging. And the way that this model works is that you assume that this forager is searching for resources in a food patch. And all of the resources that can be found in that patch can be ranked according to what's called their post-encounter return rate. A return rate, in this sense, is referring to the energy that you get per unit time. It's calories per unit time in the simple sense. The post-encounter part of that return rate, then, is referring to the fact that we're calculating this return rate after the resource has already been encountered by the forager. So the forager is moving around this patch, randomly encountering resources in proportion to their abundance. And once they encounter it, they're faced with a decision. Do they take it or do they ignore it? That decision depends on their post-encounter return rate of those resources, which is shown in this graph as these open kind of white circles. If you imagine a resource like moose or something, for example, that might be one of these high-ranking resources up here in the top left, this open circle all the way up here. Tons of kilocalories per unit time for exploiting a moose. We know this ethnographically and experimentally. We've got the return rates calculated for that species. Something like a squirrel, for example, is going to give you fewer calories per unit time. So it might be ranked somewhere around here. Something like an acorn is going to give even fewer because the processing costs are so high. You have to do a lot and invest a lot of time and effort into getting the calories out of that acorn. So that's going to be a very low-ranked species relative to something like moose. And once you have all of these different food resources ranked in order, you can then begin to understand these dietary choices that a forager faces. And in order to really determine which of these resources will be taken and which will be ignored, we need to now account for what happens before that encounter with the resource. We need to account for search costs in all of this. And in doing so, we calculate what's known as the overall return rate or foraging efficiency, the actual economic efficiency of the diet. And that's shown in these black triangles here. If you're only going after moose, if you're only going after the highest ranking species, you're going to spend probably a lot of time searching for it. So your search costs are going to be high and your overall return rate is going to be much lower than the post-encounter return rate of that moose. As you add species to your diet, your overall return rate is going to go up, right? The search costs in this model are cumulative in a sense. And so they're shared a bit between all of these resources. So these black triangles are trending upward at first as you're adding resources to this diet. Now at a certain point, you'll reach kind of the maximum overall return rate, your maximum foraging efficiency. That's identified here by this vertical black line. And what this means is that if you were to add the next highest ranking resource, this open circle here, to your diet, you would actually take a hit to your overall return rate, to your foraging efficiency. And so that resource should be ignored. You shouldn't take it. It doesn't make economic sense. Therefore, everything to the left of this line is in your optimal diet set. Everything to the right of it, you ignore if you encounter it. If, for example, the abundance of moose increased in this patch, right? If habitat changes occurred as a result of climate changes, and there's suddenly more moose to encounter, your search costs are going to go down. You're more easily able to find a moose in this patch. And so your overall return rate is going to go up. This has the effect then of narrowing your optimal diet set, of narrowing your diet breadth, as you're able to focus in on those higher ranked prey species up here. In the opposite example, right, perhaps you have overhunted moose now, and they're not as common as they once were. Your encounters with them go down. You're spending more effort in search, and so you're going to then shift from this orange line back to the black line. Your diet breadth, your optimal diet set will then expand. Hopefully this is making sense to folks, because it's really important to understand this concept of intensification. If we think of the gain rate of foraging in this patch as this black line here, right, these are the benefits that you get as a function of time. Generally, in a lot of economic activities, there's a kind of marginal returns on these gain rates. And so if you're a forager here at time point A, and you want to gain one more unit of energy, one more unit of benefit, you pay 1 unit of time cost, and you get 1 unit of benefit, and you move to point B. If you then want to get 1 additional unit of benefit and move to point C, right, you would be doubling your yields, right? The overall outputs that you're getting from this patch are increased by 100%. But in order to get to point C then, you're paying a lot more time costs, 3.5 units of time in this chart. So now your efficiency is down from 1 unit of benefit per unit time to 0.29 benefits per unit time. So you've doubled your yields, but you've lost out on efficiency. This is Bose-Ruppian intensification, and this, I think, is the key to understanding this debate over domestication around the world, really. And putting this then in context of the prey model and diet breadth, efficiency, kilocalories per hour, is generally high when diets are narrow. You're focusing in on a few high-ranked species, a few high-return rate species, and you're able to then maximize your efficiency. Efficiency then declines as you widen your diet breadth, right? You're taking more of those lower-ranked species. You're paying more costs in search and also in handling as well, and kind of processing. And so your efficiency declines with diet breadth. Yields, however, tend to be high when diets are broad because you're taking a greater variety of resources. You're taking in more biomass, and this does depend a bit on the specific resources we're talking about, but theoretically at least. Yields are high when diets are broad, and when you've got a narrow, high efficiency diet, yields tend to be lower because you're focusing in on fewer prey types. And so I think this really helps to contextualize this question of why would you domesticate? Was intensification the cause of domestication, or wasn't it? And Bruce Smith outlines really clearly some kind of expectations for each of these hypotheses. He argues that there was no intensification that drove domestication. And so to him, we would expect to see no evidence of climate or environmental change that's capable of reducing economic efficiency, of reducing foraging efficiency. He also expects that we should see low, stable, or perhaps no population growth prior to domestication, prior to initial domestication. Because population growth can impact foraging efficiency through that process of kind of overexploiting resources, resource depression, it's often called. And third, he expects that foraging efficiency, the actual benefits per unit time that foragers can get, should be high and perhaps stable prior to domestication. Now, in contrast, he says that if intensification led to domestication, we would expect to see potentially climate or environmental change that was capable of reducing foraging efficiency. We would expect to see perhaps also human population growth that's capable of reducing foraging efficiency. And finally, we would expect to see actual reductions in economic or foraging efficiency in that lead up to domestication. And so with these predictions in mind that Bruce Smith developed, I wanted to move forward and test these in interior Eastern North America with reference to the Eastern Agricultural Complex. First, looking at kind of paleo-environmental reconstructions for the region, the general consensus is that in this region, the Younger Dryas and the early Holocene were a little bit cooler and more moist. And that then in the middle Holocene, we move into a period that's warmer and drier. And a lot of this has to do with the climate period called the hypsothermal, or sometimes called the mid-Holocene climatic optimum. It's a warm and dry climate period where we know that in this region, based on a lot of pollen core records and other lines of evidence, lake levels are dropping, water tables are dropping, wetland pollen is becoming less abundant, so wetlands are probably shrinking during the middle Holocene. It's a generally drier sort of environment. And at the same time, however, there's changes in forest ecology that are happening, where oak and hickory forests are expanding. And this certainly has potential to impact the abundance of various food resources in the region. So I think that there is good evidence for environmental changes at this time, because as I said, domestication is happening beginning around 5,000 years ago. The management of these plants before domestication is probably starting more like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. So this is all really happening in the middle Holocene during this warming and drying climate period. Second, I think that there is also evidence for human population growth in the region. Shane Miller has done work from his dissertation all the way through to his recent book, arguing that there's evidence for human population growth from the Paleo-Indian period, from the Pleistocene, up into the middle Holocene. He does this through arguing that there's a pattern of kind of infilling of the landscape in Tennessee, that early on in time, some of these more profitable, kind of higher quality locations, such as the coastal plain in this case, are inhabited first. And as time goes on and population grows, people spill over from those high quality locations into lower suitability, lower quality locations. This is to be expected through a behavioral ecology model called the ideal free distribution. And it is consistent with population growth in the region. I also conducted an analysis of population growth in the region with Brian Cotting from the University of Utah, where we queried a big radiocarbon database, the Canadian Archaeological Radiocarbon Database, and found 3,500 radiocarbon dates from this region where the EAC kind of first occurred. And we modeled the frequency of radiocarbon dates through time using the kind of methodology called the dates as data approach, where it's assumed that the frequency of radiocarbon dates might correlate in some way to human demography. There's some debate about this, but it's become a very popular method. And it does show that in pretty much the 1,500 years before initial domestication occurred in this region, there was a period of statistically significant population growth, or at least statistically significant increases in radiocarbon date frequencies. So with domestication beginning to happen 5,000 years ago, starting around 6,500 years ago, we've got this significant period of population growth. And of course, it's part of a much longer trajectory of population growth going back into the Pleistocene, as Shane Miller's work showed in the previous slide. To corroborate this trend, we also looked at site counts, which is a more conventional proxy for human populations. And again, it's showing the same patterns as the radiocarbon dates. So there are all these lines of evidence that are suggesting that population growth is happening in this region. But of course, environmental change and population growth don't actually demonstrate that there was intensification happening. They're just kind of potential preconditions that would make it possible. And so to actually explore whether foraging and subsistence economies were intensified at this time, I conducted a prey model analysis using faunal remains from 6 sites in the Middle Tennessee River Valley. And essentially what I did was, as I showed you in a previous slide, ranked all of the potential prey types available in this region according to their post-encounter return rates, the calories that you get per unit time from exploiting them. And I created ratios, indices of a high-ranking prey type relative to a low-ranking prey type to kind of determine the overall foraging efficiency in the diet based on how many high-ranking species people were able to exploit versus how many low-ranking species. I first looked at kind of deer squirrel index, where I looked at the number of identified specimens, the number of deer bones identified in these assemblages, divided by the total number of deer and squirrel bones, with deer being representative of a high-ranking, high-return species, and squirrel being a much lower-ranked species, far fewer calories per unit time. And the model that I then created using these data shows that in the younger Dryas and the early Holocene, there's actually very few deer being exploited relative to squirrels. And even if you look at other faunal assemblages in the region, this pattern holds. There are very few deer in the early Holocene, and deer populations seem to be growing as we move into the middle Holocene. It's been proposed that this is due perhaps to the expansion of oak hickory forests and some other causes as well. But the important thing to note here is that this pattern of an increasing abundance of deer as the high-ranked species in this case, this is not intensification, right? This is actually an increase in foraging efficiency. This is not the decrease in efficiency that we would expect if intensification were happening. And so this is actually not supporting the intensification model for domestication. This is supporting Bruce Smith's model that intensification has nothing to do with domestication. In contrast, however, that deer-squirrel index is dealing really with kind of terrestrial or upland habitats. But so I also made indices for more wetland habitats using aquatic and semi-aquatic species. And to do this, I looked at the NISP, the number of waterfowl remains in these assemblages, relative to the number of shellfish remains, with waterfowl, geese, and ducks and things being a much higher ranked species to go after than shellfish. The freshwater mussels in these interior river valleys are very low ranked species based on the data that we've got for them. And in contrast to that deer-squirrel index, what this waterfowl index is showing is a decline in foraging efficiency. That in the younger Dryas and the early Holocene, these more moist time periods, there are more waterfowl being exploited. And as time goes on, as we move into the middle Holocene, progressively more and more shellfish are being exploited. And of course, this is very consistent with what we know about shellfish foraging in the region, the origins of the shell mound archaic, and all these other patterns. Shellfish intensification is definitely happening. And it is exactly that, it's intensification, right? It's increasing yields and perhaps increasing predictability of resource use, but it comes at the cost of efficiency. Just to verify that this pattern holds, I also conducted an analysis of fish remains relative to shellfish, and the same pattern holds true in this case. More fish are being exploited in the younger Dryas and the early Holocene relative to shellfish, at least in the middle Tennessee River Valley. And as time goes on, as we move into the middle Holocene, more shellfish are being exploited. This pattern of increasing shellfish use in the middle Holocene is often attributed to kind of the stabilization of river systems at this time that allow shellfish populations to grow. But as I explained earlier in my discussion of the prey model, the abundance of a low-ranked species in kind of strict prey model logic doesn't actually matter, right? It's the abundance of moose in the example I was giving you that really matters in determining your diet breadth and in determining foraging efficiency. There could be millions and millions of shellfish, but if your diet breadth doesn't include them because moose are so abundant, or deer or fish or waterfowl are so abundant, it doesn't matter how many there are. They're not part of your diet. And so in order to include these low-ranked species in the diet, in order to intensify your exploitation of them, the prey model predicts that you need declining abundance, declining encounters with the higher-ranking taxa, the waterfowl, the fish in this case. And I think that the culprit here is the hypsothermal. It's this mid-Holocene climate period where we've got an increasingly dry and warm climate that's leading to kind of the shrinking of wetlands, perhaps even the desiccation of certain ponds and lakes. According to some of these pollen cores, there are some bodies of water that dry up at this time period. I think this is going to have negative impacts on waterfowl and fishes at the same time that these shellfish beds are stabilizing, and that this is the process that then leads to the intensification of shellfish foraging. But fundamentally, these patterns are consistent with intensification. And so in this debate as to whether or not domestication is the result of intensification or not, I think that these evidence at least suggests that it is, that intensification does drive domestication. If we look at Bruce Smith's kind of test implications here, there is evidence of climate and environmental change that's capable of reducing foraging efficiency. There is evidence of population growth in the region prior to and concomitant with domestication. And there is actual evidence of declining foraging efficiency. The trick is that it's not universal. And Bruce Smith, in a lot of papers, does rely on that abundance of deer in the region as evidence that there is no intensification. And of course, when you just look at the deer, yeah, it seems like these terrestrial habitats are doing really well, but it's the wetland habitats that seems to be where this intensification process seems to be happening. And it's possible that this is also due to human overhunting of waterfowl and fishes. I think that the environmental change is probably a more likely culprit in this case, but that remains to be further investigated. But of course, everything I've just explained, this process of intensification of subsistence, doesn't actually explain how domestication happens. And this is a critique that Bruce Smith levies very accurately and correctly against kind of this intensification hypothesis. Intensified subsistence economies do bring people into contact with these low-ranked, the wild varieties of these EAC crops. Right? It does bring you into contact with them, but it doesn't actually explain then how the process of domestication works. And I think that the kind of body of theory that Bruce Smith uses, niche construction theory, does a really good job of this. That when you expand your diet breadth and you're incorporating these lower return plant species into your diet sets, you're using them progressively more and more, you develop familiarity with them. This leads to the development of all sorts of ecological knowledge about these plant species that permits these systems of management to develop. Right? You understand that they thrive in disturbed settings, and you can manipulate that disturbance in your own ways to promote the growth of these crops, perhaps. And through this process, these co-evolutionary mutualisms develop between plants and humans. Right? The plants rely on humans and the humans rely on these plants. It is a mutualism, ecologically speaking, that results in the co-evolution of these two kind of, groups of organisms. And so I think this is how domestication is actually happening. But it's important to note then that domestication itself is not intensification. Right? And it often gets viewed as such by people who use that more inclusive definition of intensification, where it's just an increase in yields, because certainly it is an increase in yields. But I think that it's also an increase in efficiency. And we need some more work on this, but to move from something like this wild variety of goosefoot here on the left to this domesticated variety, which is a Central American domesticated variety, that's definitely an increase in yields. Look at all the seeds that are on that picture on the right compared to the left. I think this is also an increase in efficiency as well, right? All of these classic indicators of domesticates that we talk about as archaeologists, changes in seed morphology, seed size, seed number, rind thickness, the attributes of the rachis on certain plants. These things have impacts on the economic efficiency of exploiting these plants. I think that domestication is therefore not intensification, but it's innovation, right? It's an increase in yields and an increase in efficiency. Right? And as I said, Bosrupian intensification is an increase in yields with a decrease in efficiency. And this is accomplished through time investments, really labor costs that are paid. Innovation, and I'm stealing this from Chris Morgan's work, although I'm combining some of his categories into one. Innovation is something different. Innovation is an increase in yields and an increase in efficiency. And this is made possible through an investment in capital as opposed to labor. And I'm using capital in a very, very general sense here. And I'm always kind of cautious about saying capital in these contexts. It feels a bit anachronistic. But if you understand capital as technology, or as human capital, our kind of knowledge and the social and cultural systems that we put in place to manage these plants. If you understand it as landesque capital, the environmental modifications that humans engage in, these investments in capital end up promoting increases in efficiency. I think domestication is technology, right? It is this kind of thing that you can invest in that will result in increasing yields and increasing efficiency. And I think that this process of intensification and innovation, of continually increasing yields in a lot of cases, but initially decreasing and then increasing efficiency, has led us to where we are in the present. Right? As I said, we've got declining foraging efficiency before domestication happens. This is intensification. Initial domestication, then, I would argue, is an innovation. The spread of these EAC crops around the region is also probably some sort of innovation. It's an increase in efficiency in that these are domesticated varieties that are profitable as well as productive, and adopting them into your own optimal diet set could potentially increase your overall foraging efficiency, your overall economic efficiency. Increasingly relying on these crops for a variety of reasons and kind of the new strategies of weeding or planting. A lot of these EAC crops are kind of just broadcast planted, whereas something like maize is more deliberately planted in a mound by native peoples. new harvest technologies, right? These could all be examples of intensification and also examples of innovation. Depends on the particular kind of cost-benefit relationship of these things. But I think that it's perhaps most likely that you've got periods of intensification and then periods of innovation that follow, where you're reducing efficiency and then increasing efficiency as yields go up. The introduction of maize to the region, I would argue, is an innovation, and the decreasing of reliance on EAC crops is kind of this prey model, diet breadth model type of process going on at the same time, where once maize is introduced, these EAC crops are used a little bit less often. Eventually, they're pretty much abandoned with European colonization. Some European domesticates are adopted by native peoples. Europeans then adopt some native domesticates like maize. I think these are probably innovations as well. And my point in kind of going through all of this is to say that I think that there is this process of intensification and innovation happening through thousands of years following initial domestication that progressively is actually narrowing our diet breadth towards our contemporary situation, where we're relying so heavily on just kind of these three plant species right now. We've got incredibly narrow, incredibly efficient, but high-risk diets at the moment. Now that I've explained all of this about the origins of domestication, how exactly does this help us in the present? Because I started off this talk discussing agricultural policy. And I do think that these past studies of these processes of intensification and innovation can inform on present day policy in terms of our agriculture. Innovation today would probably look like doubling down on our current subsistence practices through investments in capital, right? Planting and harvesting technology, indoor growing, hydroponics, right? Even genetically modified crops and hybrid strains that we breed. These are all investments in capital that permit increases in efficiency and increases in yields, and perhaps increased resilience as well. In contrast, intensification today looks a little bit different. There are also policy proposals that we should broaden our subsistence practices. Kind of one that's always mentioned tongue-in-cheek is kind of that we should all be eating insects or something. That's an example of an expanding diet breadth that might be more in line with intensification than innovation, right? Exploiting a greater variety of food resources. And actually a couple archaeologists have been advocating for potential policy relevance of archaeology, particularly the EAC in this context. A friend and collaborator, Stephen Carmody, as well as people like Natalie Mueller and others who have been growing these lost crops of the Eastern agricultural complex, have advocated that they could actually be planted in the present and integrated into some sort of sustainable local foods movement. This picture on the top right here is actually taken at Sewanee, the University of the South, where Stephen Carmody was a postdoc and had a garden where he grew these EAC crops and was able to grow enough of them in conjunction with their university farm that the dining hall actually was feeding these EAC crops to its students. You could go into the dining hall on campus and get some of the Eastern agricultural complex on your plate. I think that this is phenomenal, and I love this idea. What we just need to be careful of, though, is making sure that it's not pure intensification, that we're not just investing more time and labor costs in doing this and in kind of localizing these endeavors of agriculture, that we're still finding ways to innovate and increase our efficiency, because economic efficiency does matter. And this sort of logic could be applied all over the world, right? As I showed you up front, there's a dozen or more different independent centers of plant domestication around the world. And we shouldn't necessarily export goosefoot all over the world and tell people to farm it. But if everybody tapped into their own local crop complex and kind of innovated and intensified and innovated some more in that sense, this could be a very helpful policy solution and something that archaeologists have been directly working on and advocating for. There's tons of other policy proposals out there, and I won't get into all of the details, but I think that we can begin to understand a lot of these, for example, as innovations or as intensification. Putting them into this broader economic framework that I'm trying to develop and contribute to here. And just taking two of these from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, I think we can analyze them using archaeological insights. Policy A, for example, and again, this is a real policy, diversifying crop varieties, right? That we could plant a greater variety of crops to buffer against the potential risks associated with our climate crisis. An alternative policy, which here I'm calling policy B, is to develop new varieties of these crops, either GMOs or perhaps hybrids that are more resilient to climate change and perhaps can produce more, increase the productivity and perhaps even the profitability of these crops. Using the kind of conventional archaeological analogy approach to policy, if we wanted to talk about diversification of crop varieties in the face of climate change, or developing new crop varieties, we could easily find archaeological examples of this happening in the past. I'm sure that those of us on this call right now would be able to think of tons of examples of this from our own archaeological research, where a whole suite of different crops has been domesticated and that help buffer against climate change in some past context, or how new varieties of crops developed, new examples of maize, new varieties of maize, for example, that were better adapted to certain climate conditions. But again, as I said up front, policymakers in the present are going to be, I think, naturally skeptical of this, right? What does a variety of maize that was adopted thousands of years ago have to do with our current policy situation? It might have a lot to do with it. It might be a perfectly valid analogy, but the context is still so different that it might not be analogous. And that might pose problems for this sort of approach to making archaeology relevant in the present. And so what I push for instead is this integration of archaeology into broader kind of frameworks and broader bodies of knowledge, theory and models. That when we start to think of these policy proposals in terms of these concepts of innovation and intensification, and when we think of them as part of this broader economic and ecological set of knowledge that we've got, I think we can better evaluate these policies without relying directly on a perfectly analogous archaeological case study, right? And through understanding policy A as probably some form of intensification, maybe, and policy B as probably some form of innovation, we can begin to say that both of these will increase kind of yields. Both of them have the potential to increase resilience, but only one of them, if it's strictly intensification in policy A, will actually lead to an increase in economic efficiency. Policy A could lead to very great investment in time and labor that could be detrimental in a lot of ways. And so the archaeological case study that I've just discussed of the Eastern Agricultural Complex, when you generalize these processes beyond just Eastern North America, when you put it into conversation with broader level theory and models and frameworks, that then allows us to say something more concrete and tangible and probably impactful about contemporary policy. And archaeologists can either contribute to theory and leave it at that, or we can actually see this process through and advocate for the integration of our knowledge into this higher level framework, and then advocate for policy positions or evaluate policy positions based on that. I'm certainly not the first person to be talking about this. I found this quote last night as I was preparing this talk that Michael Smith, back 8 years ago, wrote, "It seems unlikely to me that policymakers will pay much attention to archaeological data. However, if archaeological findings can take their place within a broader framework of comparative knowledge, they can have an indirect effect on policy." And I think this is exactly the kind of schematic that I showed you in the previous slide. If we can take our archaeological knowledge, put it into conversation with a broader framework, we then have that indirect effect on policy. And I think that's a much more effective way to bring about change in contemporary society and in the future. Because as we all know, the human past is full of case studies. I would caution that maybe they're not perfect or direct analogies, but they can be used to inform on our present day issues if we generalize to the level of process, and if we put it into conversation with broader theory and broader sets of models, right? Talking about concepts like intensification and innovation, general ecological and economic ideas, allows us to not just test whether a specific policy worked in the past and whether it'll work in the present, but to test the actual model and the actual set of theory and knowledge that the policy is based upon, that then allows us to have more relevance in our own discipline of archaeology and actually make perhaps a more tangible and, as I said, impactful change in the present and in the future. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you to all of you, first and foremost, and thank you to all of my kind of collaborators and colleagues on this. Put my email address up there if anybody wants to reach out to me with questions. I'm happy to take any questions now if you've got them.
Yeah, please do put questions in the Q&A and we will field them over to Elic. I know that some of you may have to go, but we will be hanging around here for 15, 20 minutes, Elic, is that what we said? For those
Yeah.
who want to discuss and ask questions. So ask. Can you see the questions, Elic, or do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Perhaps would folks want to come off of mute and ask me verbally? Just so everybody can hear it.
Can we unmute individuals, Amy?
Yes, I think if they raise their hands, then you can go in and unmute them through the participants tab on the bottom.
Let me go and unmute our first question. Oh, I don't have the unmuting capabilities. Maybe Amy or Matt have unmuting capabilities.
I can do that.
If you can unmute Tim for our first question, thank you. Bear with us, folks, as we navigate Zoom webinar.
Go ahead, Tim.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me, Elic?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. And as I say in my question, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it yet. Like I take seriously and appreciate that you take seriously the fact that we should think pretty critically about how we make policy contributions, because I think too often we've myself am guilty about, you know, sort of writing these broader impacts and not sort of holding to that. But I'm sort of curious. I mean, your approach, I don't want to sort of misdiagnose it as sort of top down, but it does sort of really center these theory and models in archaeology, which I think is in some ways a contrast to a lot of what's been coming out, specifically about wildfire management in California. But also, I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of debate that raged about that Oswald paper in New England, in particular, where they essentially, my reading of it was that they sort of accused the original authors of the paper, but they sort of totally missed what exactly indigenous land management looked like in New England for all this time. And thus, they went out looking for it and didn't find it because they didn't know what they were looking for. And so I'm sort of interested in if you think there's a way to sort of integrate your approach with these sort of bottom-down approaches that sort of center traditional ecological knowledge and other indigenous practices.
Yeah, I definitely think there is. And yeah, well, this talk was about the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which is actually my master's degree work. My dissertation is all about land management in New England, so I'm definitely familiar with that Oswald paper that caused such a stir a while ago. And yeah, I think that in that case, those authors definitely missed some things that were going on and what land management actually looks like. And a lot of Native people even have responded to that, saying that obviously there's all sorts of land management going on, and just because it's not perceptible to archaeologists or to kind of paleo-environmental scientists broadly doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. But I definitely think that what I'm advocating for here is a function of my own biases and how I approach archaeology. And I'm very much a kind of deductive type of thinker, where I like broad general theory that's more, perhaps not universal, but it is more general. And then I like testing predictions from that. There's absolutely room, though, to have a more bottom-up approach. That kind of interplay that I was hinting at between the theory and the models and the archaeology, that is a kind of back and forth cyclical relationship of deductive and inductive kind of flows of knowledge. And certainly what I'm advocating for here is just one potential way for us to have policy impacts. There are myriad other ways that archaeologists can potentially have impacts on policy. I didn't discuss heritage at all. I didn't discuss kind of the contemporary relevance of archaeology. I didn't really discuss a lot of Native issues in this context. So what I'm saying here is just one potential avenue that kind of jives with what I do as an archaeologist and human ecologist. But of course, there are many other ways that this could be done, and I would very much be interested in more people having conversations about integrating that sort of bottom-up approach into things as well. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have an anonymous question, Elic. If
Okay.
maybe you want, do you want, or would you like to read it out beforehand?
I can read it. So this person asks, how might new understandings of nutrition play into this? Were people using the EAC well fed? Might new understandings about what is required for healthy diets alter our view of how to manage agriculture? That's, yeah, a very good question. In this talk, I focus very much on calories and energy, a very abstract level of thinking about subsistence and kind of food systems. But of course, the models that I've talked about could easily be changed so that instead of dealing with calories, you're dealing with nutrients, macronutrients, even micronutrients. And that has been done by people using this kind of foraging theory approach. In some cases, it seems like the health of native peoples relying on the EAC wasn't all that terrible. There's certainly health deteriorates once maize is introduced. That's kind of the big shift that has been noticed by bioarchaeologists working in the region. I'm not really aware of many negative health consequences directly as the result of the EAC, but it's also important to keep in mind that whenever the EAC was being relied upon by native peoples, it was not kind of the main part of the diet per se. And even if it was, they're still supplementing with a whole other variety of resources. They're still foraging for wild foods. They're still hunting deer and squirrel and rabbits and all these things. They're still going after wild plants, fruits and berries and things. So the EAC is still just one part, and potentially a small part at certain points in time, of a much broader and more diverse subsistence system. And that it's not until kind of we move later on in time and we have the introduction of maize that diets really start to focus in a lot more and become more narrow. Because certainly in a lot of regions of the East, which is what I'm most familiar with, by the time that Europeans arrive, a lot of the archaeological assemblages that I'm aware of, it's a lot of white-tailed deer, it's a lot of corn, and those are kind of the two main things, shellfish and fish as well. But it's not quite as diverse. But early on in kind of the archaic period that I'm talking about, in the Middle Holocene and even into the woodland period later, these are still very diverse and probably quite nutritious diets, but I'm not aware of much in terms of detail about the nutritional aspects of this. But certainly the approach that I'm outlining here, nutrition in a broader sense, can be easily integrated into this. It's just not as often done.
Maybe we'll give people a minute or two to formulate any other questions and type
Just in
them
case
out.
they're typing something, that's fine.
Yeah.
No remaining questions?
One more? Oh no, never mind. This
Might be from earlier.
yeah, it's from earlier, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no remaining questions, I know people can't clap, but thank you, Elic, so much for giving this talk today. And thank you to everybody who attended, even through all the technical issues. I apologize for that. So hopefully we'll see everybody soon at our next brown bag. And again, join me in thanking Elic silently, I guess, for this really wonderful brown bag.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Arena. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this. I appreciate it. And if you have any more questions, reach out to me on email, Twitter, whatever. I'm happy to talk more. Yeah. Thank you all very much.
Wanted to let you know, Elic, we had some people from Rapid on the